Imagine a world where the grand structures of Rome have crumbled into dust and a new, mysterious era begins to take shape. This is the Middle Ages, a 1,000-year journey through a landscape of kings, knights, and deep-seated faith that defined the very foundations of Western civilization as we know it today.
The fall of the Western Roman Empire in the 5th century left a massive power vacuum across Europe. Without a central government to provide order or protection, the continent fractured into small, warring kingdoms, marking the beginning of what historians once called the Dark Ages, a time of survival and transition.
Out of this chaos, a new social and political system emerged known as feudalism. It was a rigid hierarchy built on land and loyalty, where everyone had a specific place. At the very top sat the king, the ultimate owner of the land, who granted territories to powerful nobles in exchange for service.
These nobles, or lords, ruled over their granted lands, known as manors. In return for their power, they provided the king with military support and tax revenue. It was a system based on mutual obligation, ensuring that the king had an army whenever he needed to defend his crown or expand his borders.
Below the lords were the knights, the professional warriors of the Middle Ages. Being a knight was more than just a job, it was a status symbol. They were granted smaller parcels of land by the lords, allowing them to focus entirely on training for battle and honing their skills in combat.
At the bottom of the feudal pyramid were the peasants and serfs, who made up the vast majority of the population. They lived difficult lives, working the land from dawn till dusk to produce the food that sustained the entire society. In exchange for their labor, they received protection from the lord's knights. The manor was the heart of the medieval economy, a self-sufficient world where almost everything needed for survival was produced on site. From the blacksmith's forge to the local grist mill, the manor functioned like a tiny kingdom, isolated from the outside world by miles of dense forest and poor roads.
Towering over these manors were the great stone castles, the ultimate symbols of power and defense. Originally made of wood, they evolved into massive stone fortresses designed to withstand long sieges. With thick walls, high towers, and deep moats, they were nearly impossible for an enemy to capture by force.
Inside the castle walls, life was far from comfortable. These were military installations first, and homes second. The rooms were often damp, cold, and dark, lit only by narrow slits in the stone and smoking torches. Yet, for the lord and his family, it was the safest place in a dangerous world.
The path to becoming a knight began at a young age. At 7, a boy from a noble family would be sent to another lord's castle to serve as a page. Here, he learned the basics of courtly etiquette, religion, and the first steps of combat training, preparing for a life of service. By the age of 14, the page became a squire. This was an intensive apprenticeship where he served a specific knight directly, caring for his horses and polishing his armor. In return, the squire received advanced training in horsemanship and the use of heavy weapons like the lance and the mace. The transition to knighthood culminated in a grand ceremony. After a night of prayer and fasting, the squire was dubbed a knight, usually with a light tap of a sword on the shoulder. He was now a member of a prestigious warrior class, bound by a complex code of conduct known as chivalry. Chivalry was more than just a set of rules for the battlefield. It was a moral system that emphasized bravery, courtesy, and the protection of the weak. While the reality often fell short of the ideal, the code of chivalry helped to civilize the brutal nature of medieval warfare and society. While kings and lords controlled the land, another power dominated every aspect of daily life: the Catholic Church. In the Middle Ages, religion was not just a personal belief, it was the framework of reality. The church was the largest landowner in Europe and held immense political influence over every monarch.
The head of the church, the Pope, was often more powerful than any king. He had the authority to excommunicate leaders, effectively cutting them off from the religious community and freeing their subjects from their oaths of loyalty. This made the Pope a key player in the high-stakes game of European politics.
For the common people, the church offered the only hope for salvation in a world filled with suffering. Life was seen as a brief and difficult trial, and the goal was to reach heaven. Every major life event, from birth to death, was governed by the sacraments and rituals of the parish church.
Gothic cathedrals were built as physical representations of heaven on earth. These architectural marvels used flying buttresses to support massive walls, allowing for huge stained glass windows. For a population that was largely illiterate, these windows acted as a visual Bible, telling the stories of the faith through light and color.
Monasteries served as the intellectual hubs of the Middle Ages. In an era where very few people could read or write, monks dedicated their lives to the preservation of knowledge. They spent countless hours in scriptoriums, hand-copying ancient texts and creating beautifully illuminated manuscripts.
Science and technology progressed slowly during this period, as knowledge was largely restricted by religious doctrine. Most people believed that the world operated according to divine will rather than natural laws. As a result, the scientific method as we know it today was still centuries away from being developed.
Medical knowledge was particularly limited. Doctors of the Middle Ages based their treatments on the theory of the four humors: blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile. They believed that illness was caused by an imbalance of these fluids, leading to treatments like bloodletting that often did more harm than good.
The search for knowledge often took the form of alchemy, the precursor to modern chemistry. Alchemists spent their lives trying to find the philosopher's stone, a mythical substance that could turn lead into gold and grant eternal life. While they failed in their primary goal, their experiments led to the discovery of new substances.
In the 14th century, the Middle Ages faced its greatest challenge: the Black Death. This devastating plague swept across Europe, carried by fleas on rats. It was a catastrophe of unimaginable proportions, killing nearly a third of the continent's population in just a few short years.
The plague brought society to a standstill. With no understanding of germs or hygiene, people were helpless to stop the spread. Many believed it was a punishment from God, leading to waves of religious fervor and panic. Entire villages were abandoned as the social order began to crumble under the weight of the death toll.
Ironically, the massive loss of life led to significant social changes. With fewer peasants available to work the land, those who survived could demand higher wages and more rights. This began to loosen the grip of feudalism, as the rigid hierarchy of the past could no longer be maintained in a world with a labor shortage.
The Middle Ages were also a time of conflict between East and West. The Crusades were a series of religious wars fought to reclaim the Holy Land. While the military goals were rarely achieved, the Crusades opened up trade routes and brought new ideas, spices, and technologies back to Europe.
Exposure to the Islamic world introduced Europeans to advanced mathematics, medicine, and philosophy. Works by ancient Greek thinkers like Aristotle, which had been lost to the West, were rediscovered through Arabic translations. This influx of knowledge began to spark a new intellectual curiosity.
As trade increased, towns and cities began to grow. These urban centers became hubs of commerce and craft, moving away from the purely agricultural focus of the manor. The rise of a new middle class of merchants and artisans began to challenge the traditional power of the landed nobility. Education also began to move outside the monastery walls. The first universities were founded in cities like Bologna, Paris, and Oxford. These institutions were dedicated to higher learning in law, medicine, and theology, producing a new generation of thinkers who would eventually lead Europe toward the Renaissance.
The nature of warfare was changing too. The invention of the longbow and later gunpowder meant that a common soldier could now defeat a heavily armored knight from a distance. This shift signaled the end of the knight's dominance on the battlefield, and, by extension, the decline of the feudal system.
By the 15th century, the world was moving on. The discovery of the printing press would soon revolutionize the spread of information, and the voyages of exploration were about to expand the known world. The Middle Ages were coming to an end, giving way to the rebirth of art and science in the Renaissance.
The Middle Ages are often misunderstood as a stagnant time of darkness, but they were actually a period of profound growth and foundational change. From the beauty of Gothic cathedrals to the birth of universities, the medieval world built the bridges that led Europe into the modern age.
As we look back at this 1,000-year saga, we see a story of human resilience, faith, and the slow, steady march of progress. The Middle Ages were not an end, but a beginning, a crucible that forged the identity of the Western world. Thank you for journeying through history with us today.